BreadTheLoaf.
Boo. Did I get you? Now, holiday festivities aside, I do still have a game to talk about. I never really knew about the Alone in the Dark series until relatively recently. It wasn't until after I dived headfirst into the Resident Evil franchise of games that I really started to explore the genre of survival horror. Of course, I've seen references to it through various YouTube videos and internet posts that I've seen throughout my time online, though most of the time it was nothing more than a vague hand wave while talking about something more interesting and notable. It was never really anything too specific or deep now that I think about it. Now, like I've said, I've been really getting into the survival horror genre recently. From the campy B-movie stuff like Dead Island, Deadly Premonition, and even Dead Rising, to the mascot horrors of Five Nights at Freddy's, Poppy Playtime, Bendy and the Ink Machine, and things of the sort. As well as gritty and visceral survival horror like Cry of Fear, Dead Space, and Silent Hill. Fuck, even weird obscure shit like D or Illbleed have really caught my attention as well. Lucky for me, something very bizarre happened at the start of 2023. During the February Nintendo Direct, it was announced that Game Boy games were finally being added to the Switch Online service. Of course, some of the most iconic and classic Game Boy games were included from the start. Tetris, Mario Land 2, Kirby's Dream Land, Metroid 2, Wario Land 3, beloved classics. But there was a game that completely blindsided a bunch of people, including myself.
Alone in the Dark, The New Nightmare.
Alone in the Dark, The New Nightmare is quite the compelling and unique experience for the Game Boy Color. But before I discuss it in depth, in classic BreadTheLoaf fashion, I feel a brief history lesson is in order, especially because this is such a niche franchise. It is my belief that Alone in the Dark is genuinely a very underappreciated game of old, much like everything I talk about on this channel. But with that, the franchise had failed to find a voice for itself within the world of survival horror, as better, more improved games that built off its foundations came out and gained their own notoriety. As I'll get into, Alone in the Dark has a bit of an identity problem. As the series went on, it struggled to maintain its own interesting voice and unique appeal, and had become, ironically enough, really derivative of its own inspired works later on. That's not to say, though, that it wasn't very compelling and interesting at the start, though. Alone in the Dark as a series takes a lot of inspiration from the Lovecraftian cosmic horror of Cthulhu, Wild West aesthetics, Victorian-esque aesthetics, as well as the works of H.R. Geiger and voodoo mysticism. While working as a dev at Infogrames, Frederick Reynolds started working on the game engine that would eventually turn into the first Alone in the Dark game, alongside Didier Chanfray, who made the 3D models. After creating the initial room of the attic, the first room of the first game, an internal contest was held to create the art to complete the 3D prototype. Yael Burroughs managed to win the contest, and she was soon added to the core team. Shortly after the first game's release, a major disagreement happened between the development team and Infogrames director Bruno Banel. When Banel tasked Reynolds and his team to create the next Alone in the Dark title, Infogrames had requested that they use the same engine as they did with Alone in the Dark 1. Reynolds and his team felt too restricted with this request, and as a result, most of the original team had left Infogrames and formed their own studio by the name of Adeline Software International. And this little studio has a broad history of its own that I don't personally think is relevant to Alone in the Dark, but to quickly summarize. Adeline Software International was created as a subsidiary of Delphine Software International. ASI created the game series Little Big Adventure, an adventure game for the PC published by Activision. ASI would eventually have its core team sold off to Sega, becoming No Cliché, which created Dreamcast classics like Toy Commander, Toy Racer, and the Dreamcast port of Quake 3 Arena. Unfortunately, because of this left ASI back with Delphine Software completely empty. Delphine Software had Adeline Software start several projects only for them to go nowhere, and then Delphine Software would completely close in 2004.
This is boring, get back to Alone in the Dark.
Fine, if you want to fucking be like that. Alone in the Dark 1, released in 1992, set the foundation for a lot of the things that we would see in the Alone in the Dark series and the greater survival horror genre for the rest of time. It introduced the use of a dual perspective storytelling system through letting the player choose between either Edward Carnby or Emily Hartwood as the player character, which each character has their own unique story that intertwines with the other fairly often. That in turn inspired Resident Evil and Resident Evil 2's use of the same idea. Alone in the Dark also introduced weight-based inventory systems which would be used in countless games across the board, not just survival horror. While not being the first of its kind, it did kind of introduce the idea of short, intense bursts of combat in the survival horror games, comparatively to prolonged, consistent combat through the entire game, such as games like Doom or Quake, which, let me remind you, Doom is supposed to be a horror game. The soundtrack and writing were particular highlights of the game. Reynolds decided to include key texts within the game alluding to the events of the pre-story, to help give the game a heavy background that couldn't be easily told through the limited graphics at the time. The music was created in-house by Infogrames composer Philippe Vichet. They had created the very haunting and organic tracks that would enhance the fear within the player. Reynolds initially intended to keep the music limited to enemy encounters, however, Vichet convinced him to include it randomly throughout the game to make the player feel like they're in danger, no matter where they were. Alone in the Dark 2, because, like I mentioned earlier, the original team had left to become Adeline Software International, was not directed by Frederic Reynal like the first one was. Instead, it was directed by Frank Di Gorliami, and he had a much different idea for where the sequel and also the franchise should go. One-Eyed Jack's Revenge had begun departing rather dramatically from the initial Lovecraftian and Poe-inspired influence. It still maintained a bit of it through the heavy use of voodoo black magic, but that's about as far as it went. The primary villains are pirates and gangsters, significantly less horror-esque than Ezekiel Preggs from the first game, who, while being a pirate, was also heavily invested in performing macabre rituals to summon evils and demons. Most of the game has the player controlling Edward alone, but occasionally Grace Saunders has sections where she is playable. One-Eyed Jack's Revenge was released both on floppy disk and CD-ROM. The CD-ROM version sported an exclusive section with Grace Saunders and voice acting for the whole game, unlike the floppy disk version. Jack in the Dark was a shorter game made during the production of the second game and released a few months after the fact. It was more focused on the puzzles and actually doesn't have any combat to it at all. Instead of Edward, the game focuses on the young girl Grace Saunders, where she enters a toy store on the dreaded night of Halloween. The plot of the game is genuinely absurd, but overall it's not a bad experience from Alone in the Dark. A later bundle of Alone in the Dark 1 and 2 included Jack in the Dark. This one had a change in director again, this time being Christian Sklorin, who was much more interested in keeping this new installment more in line with Alone in the Dark 1. This time, Edward Carnby gets sent to a small ghost town in the Mojave Desert in search of a missing film crew and Emily Hartwood. He soon discovers the curse that has engulfed the town, and that a malicious cowboy by the name of Jed Stone is behind it all. Ghosts in Town leans into its themes very strongly, through the set dressing as well as the available weapons and enemies you can encounter. The entire town is filled with zombie outlaw cowboys, and later in the game, these will mutate into monstrous creatures from exposure to radiation. This was the first Alone in the Dark game to only release on CD-ROM, and as a result is the first Alone in the Dark to release with voice acting. In 2001, Infogrames took another swing at survival horror through their tried-and-true franchise that was sitting dormant for the last 7 years.
Alone in the Dark.
To promote the game, Infogrames and Semic Comics published a little prequel story to introduce players and readers to the new established history of this iteration of Alone in the Dark. Yeah, this is a sort of reboot to the franchise, something that isn't uncommon for Alone in the Dark to experience as time went on. It had a couple of soft and hard reboots throughout its time, but we'll get to those when we need to. Alone in the Dark, Life is a Hideous Thing, sets up who Edward Carnby and Aline Cedric are, their relationship and why they're working together, and it almost directly leads into Alone in the Dark, The New Nightmare. The New Nightmare completely redesigned Edward, turning him from a cartoonish-looking butler into a gritty, brutish bastard of a man. This iteration of Carnby, now stay with me for a minute, Instead of being an experienced paranormal investigator like he was in the first 3 titles, this time he's a part of a lineage of shadow hunters who are born on the 29th of February, every 40 years, and yes, before you ask, every single time they are each named Edward Carnby. I wish I was making that up. Yes, it's that absurd. Anyways, the new nightmare tasks this new chosen one Carnby and a young ethnologist by the name of Eileen Cedric, who contacted Edward Carnby after discovering that his best friend and partner, Charles Fisk, was found dead on an island off the coast of Massachusetts. Carnby and Cedric soon fly to the island in Cedric's seaplane, only for it to come under attack by an unknown creature. Carnby and Cedric escape, parachuting onto the island, Carnby landing far off in a forested area while Cedric landed on the roof of the mansion that resides in the center of the island. The new nightmare was published initially on the PlayStation 1 and Dreamcast by the studio Darkworks. Another studio, Spiral House, ported the Dreamcast version to the PC, as well as the PS2. All versions were published by Infogrames themselves, though. However, to finally rope this back to the start of the video, Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare had one more port that was unlike any other on the market. One specifically made for the Game Boy Color. So, truth be out there, I never had a Game Boy as a kid. Or really any handheld console. I was pretty restricted at the time to consoles that had games that multiple people could play at a time. Call it a side effect of having siblings, I guess. Anyways, like I mentioned at the start of the video, Alone in the Dark 4 was a launch title for Nintendo's Game Boy Switch Online service, and seeing as around that time I was really getting into Alone in the Dark, I decided to check it out and see what I thought about it. The Game Boy Color version is an almost entirely different variant of the game that was developed by Pocket Studios, who are known mostly for working on Game Boy ports of games. And despite what other studios would do for a game like this, Pocket Studios was able to use the background renders from the Dreamcast version of the game, albeit heavily compressing them, to keep the same general feeling of the visuals. However, as a side effect of being on the Game Boy Color, Pocket Studios had to either shrink the active play area of some locations while also removing others entirely, resulting in a very condensed, but simplified, iteration of the game. This game utilized a scanline color switching system to give the illusion of the game having more colors than it actually does. I don't know how it works exactly, but it makes the game look very weird. With all that out of the way, we can finally dig into the game that took me like 13 minutes to actually talk about. Much like the other versions, Edward Carnby receives a call from a young ethnologist named Eileen Cedric, who informs him that his old partner, Charles Fisk, went missing after going to a mysterious island off the coast of Massachusetts. Though in this one she offers to fly Edward to the island in her seaplane, in which the two then soon set off. Landing safely a ways away from the mansion, Eileen stays by the seaplane while Edward goes to explore. After exploring the island a bit and coming across dangerous spiders and wild animals, Edward discovers a seemingly abandoned mansion. And within the mansion is a visage of Charles Fisk, who tells Edward that a man named Professor Alan Morton has obtained a strange but powerful native statuette and is using it to unleash beasts from the underworld, to wreak havoc upon the world and for himself to become a powerful beast. Fisk requests that Carnby get his revenge, steal the statuette from Morton, and then kill him before he becomes too powerful. The New Nightmare splits gameplay into one of two sections, the first section being this exploration section, which is most of the game. And then there's another little combat minigame section. The exploration section consists of Edward finding items, weapons, and solving puzzles around the island. Most of the puzzles, though, are barely more elaborate than find the item you need to use here. However, one section later in the game is a guess the correct path maze puzzle. It only happens the one time, and it's not particularly difficult to figure out. These areas consist of pre-rendered 3D backgrounds that sometimes look like oatmeal due to the compression of the Game Boy Color, making some things difficult to make out. Though the game helps with this by having these little shine spots to show that there's something interactable.
Could've used some of that yellow paint, you know what I'm saying?
It's not actually all that awful when you're moving around the area. Edward moves at a decent speed, so you never really feel like you're restricted from accessing an area due to how far it is. Though it makes the island feel much smaller due to how fast you can move around the game. The combat section, however, is a section completely unique to the Game Boy Color version of the game. It's a hand-drawn isographical perspective. Some areas are top-down like the Zelda titles, and others give the illusion of depth by having it at an angle, like the GBA, Rayman, and Spyro games. Visually speaking, it looks great on the Game Boy Color. Everything looks hand-drawn and feels more like how Edward looks in-game. However, it's plagued with issues. Edward moves irritatingly slow during these sections, making it really difficult to avoid enemies or evade their attacks. Alongside that, you don't even move accurately to the perspective. You move at a slightly different angle to the way the floor does, which just bothers the fuck out of me. Because of the limits of the Game Boy, aiming in this game is as much a chore as moving is. Because of its nature, enemies very often move just barely out of the way of your weapon, making actually landing the shots a raffle on if you hit it or not. Either way, the combat section, while it looks great, is really janky and clunky in terms of movement and combat, causing dread every time Edward spots a critter meandering around. The combat's gameplay aside, it has a small selection of decent weaponry that Edward can use to protect himself when need be. Initially, he brings with him a revolver, which is a weak weapon useful for taking out small spiders, bugs, and a lifesaver, for when you run out of ammo for the other two, more powerful weapons. Ammo for this is everywhere, but does start dwindling out near the end of the game, as expected with this kind of adventure. Overall, it's a decent starting weapon, with a good amount of range, accuracy, and a decent fire rate. When exploring the mansion, Edward can soon discover a shotgun in one of Morton's studies. However, Morton had removed the firing mechanism from all the shotguns, as his employees had begun using them to fight off the creatures he had summoned. After finding a replacement part in the attic, Edward can finally use it for its intended purpose. And it's not a bad weapon at all. It's able to take down most of the enemies with 1 or 2 shots, but the downside of it is that its accuracy and fire rate are very low and slow, like most shotguns are. Ammo for the shotgun is scattered, but not uncommon. You can find it often during combat, but rarely outside of it. Late in the game, at the laboratory across the island from the mansion, is a crossbow lying just outside of the entrance. This crossbow is the best weapon in the entire game, able to take down all standard enemies with only 1 or 2 shots. However, ammo for it is very scarce, and from what I've seen, it's best to hold off on using it for only extreme circumstance or against Morton himself. Alongside these weapons, Edward can find items to help him with getting further into the mansion, as well as across the island. He can also find various pages of Morton's journal, as well as clippings from newspapers about him, revealing bits of his past and how he became such a threat. Edward can also find 3 types of healing potions during his adventure, which is different to the other versions, as those ones just have single-use medkits scattered throughout the game. An orange potion, which heals only 10 HP, a green potion that heals 20 HP, and a blue potion that heals 25 HP. These aren't rare per se, but they're not common either. These are best saved for when it's absolutely necessary, in my own personal opinion.
Psst. Between us, I once heard that Edward got wickedly hammered on those health pots and was found face down on a beach in Miami. But that's just a rumor, keep it on the down low.
Edward, in his hunt for Morton, comes across various animals and monsters summoned by him to stop intruders. Some of the first creatures encountered are these tiny spiders and regular dogs. The spiders are hard to hit due to their size, and despite their speed, they don't inflict a lot of damage. Spiders can go within 1 shot of the revolver though, so they're not too bad. The dogs though are a bit slower and are much stronger than the spiders. These take 3 to 4 hits from the revolver to take care of. Dogs show up pretty consistently during the mansion and island's entrance, however they get replaced by a bigger threat in due time. During the midpoint of the game, you finally start seeing some of the underworld monsters Morton summoned, being these 4-legged beasts that look and act like more powerful dogs, taking about 4 to 5 shots to kill. Moving slower than the dogs, but they also take a good chunk of health if you get bit by them. When Edward gets to the sewers underneath the mansion, he finds these giant serpent-like leeches which can't be killed, and will eat him whole if he gets too close. As a result, these guys are best to be just walked around, which isn't very hard to do. Lastly, you have Alan Morton himself. You fight him once near the middle of the game at a shrine of sorts. However, a few buckshots from the shotgun will cause him to vanish elsewhere to heal and reassess his situation. At the end of the game, just outside the mansion's courtyard, Morton strikes again, now much more powerful and way more pissed since he stole his statuette. He attacks Edward by teleporting around the screen and swiping at him, but if you held off on using the crossbow until now, a bunch of bolts lobbed at him will take him out pretty quickly. Morton really likes to spawn right behind Edward. Since you move super slowly in the combat sections, turning around is kind of a hit or miss. which leads to Morton getting more hits on Carnby than the other way around. The final boss fight doesn't really feel fair, but it's not impossible to beat, just very agitating. The new Nightmare uses heavily bit-crushed ambience to help create a spooky setting, but personally I think things become a little funnier when they're heavily bit-crushed, so a lot of the frog and owl noises just sound like farts in a bathtub for the most part. Other than that, it's mostly a quiet game. Music only really happens during cutscenes, the main menu, and the credits. The lack of audio in some places gives a very isolating feeling, especially when you're bumbling around the mansion just trying to figure out what to do next. Overall, I quite like Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare. It's got a very unique style and feeling for the Game Boy that not even the Resident Evil Game Boy Color title could capture properly. Despite my thorough enjoyment of the game though, it's not without its faults. Personally, I have a hard time adapting to older games because I just forget to save sometimes. This isn't really the game's fault, this is just a minor grievance I have with old games in general. I struggle due to modern titles having autosave systems implemented, so there were a few moments where I had made significant progress just to die and be sent back to a previous save, which could be anywhere from 5 to 20 minutes. And since this game is only like an hour and a half long, that's a wide range of the game's time. The combat is also seriously atrocious. Edward moves at about half the speed he does when he's exploring, and it's not a benefit for aiming. It feels more like a hindrance due to how slowly you turn. It's almost pointless to create any space between you and the enemy, because most of them will close that gap by the time you finally turn to attack anyways. As a result, it just makes it more frustrating than any sort of challenging or fun. Like I said, it's not the worst Game Boy game out there by a wide margin. However, with that, I don't think it's a necessary play if you're a fan of survival horror, but if you are interested in getting into Alone in the Dark, I do recommend it as a starting point, as it's one of the shortest games in the series and it's the easiest to adapt to if you're coming from a modern playstyle. It also maintains and utilizes a lot of the same mechanics and ideas that the rest of the franchise upholds. Its exploration is much smoother and engaging than it is in the first three titles, in my opinion. However, its combat bogs the game down quite a lot, especially since getting into combat freezes the entire game to let Edward announce that he's getting into combat, which I'm sure it helps a bunch of people with the gameplay change, but for me personally, I feel it ruins a lot of the stress and anxiety that survival horror combat sections should cause. Although with that said, I really don't have any better ideas on how to implement a survival horror combat section into a Game Boy game, so maybe I'm asking for a bit much. After The New Nightmare, Alone in the Dark went into another coma, despite generally favorable reception from the greater public. However, that wasn't the last game ever released, and its identity crisis continued on into the new millennium. In 2008, Infogrames, now Atari SA, released the newest reboot in the Alone in the Dark series, just calling it Alone in the Dark. Initially, it was released for the Xbox 360 and PC, with a slightly different version released for the PlayStation 2 and Wii, which changed a few levels and removed the free roaming from the Xbox 360 and PC versions. A few months later, a PlayStation 3 version was released called Alone in the Dark Inferno, which improved a lot of the gameplay systems, such as the driving controls, a more user-friendly inventory, as well as pulling the third-person camera back a bit. This was also the first fully real-time 3D Alone in the Dark entry, as all previous ones were 3D character models superimposed on 2D pre-rendered backgrounds. In 2015, Infogrames released their last attempt at making Alone in the Dark a notable franchise, creating a cooperative survival horror game akin to Left 4 Dead called Alone in the Dark Illumination, in which 1 to 4 players can play a gauntlet of randomly generated levels, fighting off enemies using either firearms or supernatural powers depending on the character. Unfortunately for Atari SA, Alone in the Dark Illumination missed the mark for a lot of people, and received overwhelming negative response, which caused Atari SA to sell the rights to the franchise to THQ Nordic in 2018. Alone in the Dark 2024 is the first hard reboot in the entire franchise. I say that because it's the only one to not really acknowledge the previous installments all that much, comparatively to the rest of the series. However, 2024 attempts to remake the first game for a more modern audience in mind, while still keeping in line with the themes and ideas of the first Alone in the Dark game. Interestingly and also promisingly, this game is being written by Mikhail Hedberg, who also wrote other widely beloved survival horror games, like Amnesia: The Dark Descent and Soma from Frictional Games. Even Frederick Raynal gave his approval to the remake, saying Pieces Interactive did a great job preserving the core feeling of the original game. In May 2023, a demo prologue for the full game released titled Grace in the Dark, and I played it. And it was pretty promising, despite the graphical and input device-related bugs that I'd faced. Alone in the Dark is a fascinating little series of games. Despite its struggles to find a voice within the industry, but even then, it has some really solid gems that are well worth the time. Recently I obtained the first 5 games, and I've been very slowly playing through them, and it's made me super interested in checking out the remake when it comes out. As a very late addition to this video, literally the day before this video gets posted, I found out someone on the Pico-8 forums had done an Alone in the Dark 1 demake of sorts in the Pico-8 engine, and it's actually fascinatingly great. I'm really surprised at how well it's done. I'll link it in the description alongside the Creators Post-mortem write-up that they did after the fact. Apparently they had even gotten the attention of Frederick Raynal, who is very interested in Pico-8 projects, so that's cool. If you're looking for a more in-depth look at Alone in the Dark, I recommend checking out my playthrough of it over on Breadplays with my friend Asher. We played it for the Halloween season, and it was a pretty good time.
Oh my god, that flashing.
Yeah, it's not great.
Hopefully, having a very well-experienced horror game writer, as well as a powerful set of leading actors through David Arbor and Jodie Comer, as well as being published by THQ Nordic, perhaps Alone in the Dark can finally find a voice for itself within the world of survival horror. However, anything can happen when you're alone in the dark.